Hey there, welcome to Board Game Hot Takes, the podcast where we give our immediate reactions to the hottest board games just minutes after playing them. My name's Tim.
And this is Chris.
This is Adam.
And today we're going to give our hot take review on the game we just finished playing, Chaos in the Old World. But before we do have some poll results to discuss. Every week on social media, I ask a poll question. And you, listeners, can respond if you'd like to and be a part of this poll. This week I asked a poll on social media, favorite board game randomization component. And the options I gave were dice, cards, a bag pull, like pulling shits out of a bag, or a spinner. The way people answered this on Twitter, dice was 34.1%, and on Facebook 17%. Cards was 40.9%, and on Facebook 37%. Bag pull was 24.5% on Twitter, and Facebook really rallied behind bag pulls at 46% there. Twitter, spinner actually got a 0.5%, but nobody on Facebook wants a spinner.
It's got to be life.
I want to know the game they were thinking of.
Well, I might have a comment to chat about that in just a second.
All right.
Oh, good.
So how did you guys answer this poll?
I answered this one on Twitter. I put cards, but really it depends. I can think of a situation where I love the bag pull. It depends on how it's implemented. I think in general, cards is my favorite way to go because cards can be so versatile, multi-use. You can put all kinds of text on there and icons and this and that. So in general, cards are my favorite way to go. But think about Wonderland's War. I love how the bag is used there and what each token means. Because really, each token is actually just a card, and it tells you on the side what that token does because it's another card that explains. Anyway, so it's kind of cheating with that. But then you can go on and use those tokens for other things. So it does it well in Wonderland's War. But in general, I got to go with cards.
Yeah, and same answer sort of as Adam, at least in that I cheated. But I cheated because I had to cheat here because, a poll can't reflect subtlety. And this is a question that requires subtlety. So I think there's actually, I'll cut spinner out. Spinner is definitely not one of them. But the other three, I think they're all really good arguments for all three of the others. So dice, super easy. You throw them down. It's still exciting because, you don't know what's going to come up. But it's simple. It's quick, it's easy. If you want just straight excitement, bag pull, man. Wonderland's War, I think, is a great example, Adam. There's nothing as thrilling as pulling the token out and seeing which token you're going to get. I think that's the most exciting one. But cards let you pull in all different kinds of opportunities. There's so much versatility. You can put text on the card. They're also fun because they have graphics on them usually. There's some kind of art on the cards, and I really like that too. So I think there's an argument in a case, in a situation for all three of those, but spinners, you're off the island, dude.
Yeah, I voted for cards as well, mainly just because of how much you can put on it, how much text you can put on it. Although I played Hamburg, one of the new Feld City collections this week, and they opted to not put any text on it. Instead, they put some confusing icons down at the bottom and lots of artwork on it. So that was kind of sad. But yeah, generally cards give you the most variety, right? You can put tokens in a bag and pull them out and look at a card over to the side, but you're still only pulling the same 6 tokens out or the same 6 cards, versus a stack of cards can have so much subtlety on them, so many different options, so much variety. So I really like the opportunity to use cards, and you can use them in any combination you want to. Look at the battle cards in Scythe, for example. It's just 4 different numbers, but they're in there in different quantities. And so I think generally cards work for most situations.
Now I'm going to make a small plug here for lowly spinner, right? Everyone's going to think the game of life for spinner, but one implementation I think is amazing, and it's not really a board game, but it's The Price is Right. That spinner where they spin around, it makes that little noise. Bob Barker's going, go ahead and spin it, and you hear the little doot, 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 doot. And is it going to hit one of the greens? Is it going to hit $1? You can't tell me that's one of the most exciting implementations of a spinner in some kind of a game.
I don't even know what to say to that. That's a pretty inaccessible game to most of us. I'd love to go on Prices Right.
Good point.
But let me make another argument for bag pull though, because unlike the other three, where it's just, you do a thing and then it's out of your hands, there's that false sense of agency that comes with a bag pull. You're feeling the tiles going, oh man, which one am I pulling? Do I have the right one? It's completely up to you whether you get the right one or not. Obviously, there's no way you can tell, but it still feels like it. And that adds another little bit of excitement to the bag pull, I think.
I got to go back to the Price is Right spinner. I've watched some of those shows where you could tell the guy's putting the right amount of finesse on it and trying to aim it for that dollar spot. And that's epic. It's epic, Chris. You can't deny that.
Is that how you feel, Adam, when you go to like, Vegas and you pull on the handle of that slot machine and you think that if you pull it just the right pressure, you're going to...
I've taken a stats class and I know to never go to Vegas and play any kind of slot machine.
All right, well, some of our listeners had some good responses here. And as always, if you don't follow us on social media, find us on Twitter at BG_hot takes or over on our Facebook group. Be part of the conversation because there were some really good answers here. I'm just going to read a few of them. Roscoe Shock said, the most exciting moment in board games is the split second before your dice stops rolling. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about dice later tonight, Roscoe. I might have rated a little bit higher before this evening, but right now dice are on my naughty list. Sylvain Rufo over on our Facebook group, where everybody was all in on bag pulls. And this was one of many, in fact, all of the comments on Facebook were about bag pulls. So Sylvain said, oh my goodness, bag pull is my favorite. It often feels like something might bite or sting your hand as you're diving it in that dark hidden place. It considerably adds up to our stressful plays of Nemesis. It is also a great idea in Bullet or in the Loops. Very good lighter games. Ben Green on Twitter said, reaching into a bag and feeling all the thingies clacking around and knowing the exact one you want is in there, brushing across your fingertips and the dark secrecy of that liminal space. Very poetic, you guys. I love the way you think about bag pulls. Can't disagree there. I always feel like no matter what's in that bag, I'm always going to pull out the one thing I don't need. I never feel that way with cards. So I don't know. I think there's a little bit about dice and bag pulls that feel like the luck is worse for me than with cards. Maybe it's just because of the odds in a big stack of cards.
I don't know if you guys knew, but I enjoy a game called Azul. It's one of my favorites. And the bag pull in that game is just so tactile. When I heard that description, Chris, you were talking about the physical interaction with the pieces there, the clickety clack. I think the bag pull in Azul has to be one of the best. And it's not even, too high stakes. It's just putting tiles out there and it's still fantastic.
Well, and I hope, Adam, that you're not intentionally cheating and pulling the exact tiles you want for the...
That's exactly. I can tell what color they are when I touch them.
David, Eclectic Camel, over on Twitter, his answer was Pogs. Now, and then he said, I mostly kid, but the very Pog-like runes in Runebound 3rd Edition are why I love that game so much. So if you're not of a very specific age, if you're too old or too young, you probably don't know what Pogs are because they were a very big trend for about 6 months back in, 1987. But Pogs are basically just like these two-sided discs. And, when he said this, I was like, oh, okay, that was a silly answer. But then I looked at Runebound 3rd Edition. And basically the way it is you grab this handful of discs. I don't know if they're in a bag or what, but they're double-sided and they have different effects on both sides. So it's not just like a D2, like a win or loss condition. It's like, think of if you're pulling chits out of Wonderland's War, but the chits could be double-sided with different effects on both of them. And they're big enough to print kind of different iconography and effects on each side. So you don't always just have wins or losses. I was actually pretty impressed with that when I looked at this Runebound game, that there's some potential there. I don't know. And then the last one I'm going to read is Mark G. He said, I think the spinner is sadly misaligned. There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do in that space that you can't do with cards or dice and would be tricky with a bag pull. Now, you have to go take a look at the Twitter feed and look at his response because he actually gave visual representations of several very interesting ways that you could use a spinner, which I never would have thought of and I can't explain on this through audio. So go take a look at the Twitter feed and take a look at those examples because there are some pretty interesting things that he highlighted there. That was a very fun discussion about randomization in board games. And again, I think it's very relevant for tonight's episode. We'll be circling back on that in just a little bit. For now, let's jump over to a description of Chaos in the Old World.
In Chaos in the Old World, you find yourself in the old world from Warhammer lore, which coincidentally, none of us know much about. And not only are you in this world, you're a god of chaos, using your unique abilities to control the other gods and the old world itself. You can do this in one of two ways. The first, accumulate 50 or more victory points by the end of the round, with the majority of those victory points coming from area control. Alternatively, players can advance their unique threat wheels to its final step. Players do this by meeting the requirements of their specific god. This can be something as simple as taking out an enemy troop, or done by something like having 2 or more cultists in a land with a noble after the battle phase has occurred. The conditions are dependent on which god you're playing. Each god has a unique deck of cards, a special condition for advancing their threat wheel, followers or troops that all do something slightly different, and a deck of upgrade cards earned by advancing the threat wheel. In a typical round, players will draw cards, reveal an event, pay and play to deploy cards or troops to the different territories on the board, resolve battles via dice, earn area control points, deploy corruption tokens, check for corrupted or ruined land, earn more points, and finally, check for victory. If neither player nor the game has won, the chaos continues for another round. Chaos in the Old World was designed by Eric M. Lang and originally released in 2009 by Fantasy Flight Games. It's holding strong on the Board Game Geek ranking list at 155 overall.
Thanks for that description, Adam. Before we jump into the conversation here about the gameplay and mechanisms, I'll just mention that this was a first play for all three of us. We played on Tabletop Simulator tonight. Now, Chaos in the Old World is out of print. You can't buy this game, and it's unlikely to be reprinted. So keep that in mind. But, a lot of people still have copies around. You can play it on Tabletop Simulator. You might be able to borrow a game from a local game library or something like that if you really want to get this played. It was one we wanted to explore. Eric Lang is a favorite designer of ours. We've talked about a lot of his other games, and so this was kind of a grail game. Chris had mentioned it on his top 5 games he wanted to play this year list, so we got it knocked out right away. Well, let's jump into the gameplay and mechanisms.
The card play. We talked about the different types of randomization. You've got dice in this game. I'm sure you'll touch on, Tim, but you also have the cards. So each faction has a deck of, I don't know how many, they're called chaos cards, and depending on their faction, you draw a certain amount. Steve's faction got to draw 5. Mine got to draw 2. I think Tim's got 3, and Chris's was another 2. So it's a variable per faction. And then you're looking at these, how can I use these? Those you get to buy and you put out in an area, and they have these different relatively random effects. They're going to invoke chaos on the game, and battles later on, they're going to have all these different effects on the upcoming phases of the game. And that card play aspect here, I thought was fantastic.
I wish I loved the card play aspect of this a little bit more. I did like the fact that each faction had its own deck, and so they were unique. But the downside of that is that I felt all my cards sucked. I didn't actually like playing my cards very well. So I kept pulling these, cards out of my hand and being like, what am I going to do with this? I have nothing I can do with this card. So I will say, in theory, that was a really cool thing. Maybe it depends on what faction you're getting.
Well, I'll just mention really quickly that Chris won the game, and he surprised us all, because of a specific card he played in the last round. And without that card, he would not have won the game. We would have gone to the next round, and several of us would have had a chance to win it. So I understand, Chris, you thought your deck sucked, but it seems like it worked okay for you. I really like these cards, and it did a couple things. Not only did it give each player some variable kind of special actions they could use each turn, which I think is what elevates this game a bit from its later, kind of a successor to this game, a game that copied a lot of the mechanisms, which is Cthulhu Wars. And we'll talk a little bit more about some comparisons there. But I think the fact that you never knew for sure what actions a player could take was exciting, sometimes a little frustrating when they got in your way. But the other thing that the cards did is that when you played a card, you had to play it out into one of the regions of the map that you were competing for. And this was really interesting because it wasn't just like, hey, I pay the cost and then I've got this effect. I played into a region of the map, and many times that effect applied only to that region. But more importantly, there was only 2 slots in each region where you could play a card. And that meant that sometimes, you could try to use those just to block other people from getting in there and having some impact. Like, you knew some of these cards can impact your region. So many times I'd be like, okay, I got to play a card there just to make sure that nobody else can get in there, or try to get 2 in there before someone else slides 1 in. And that was a really interesting tension. You weren't just worried about the characters you could see or what people could play as far as characters. You had to watch out for what cards might slide into a region when you weren't expecting it. And that was a really cool piece of this.
That subtlety to me, Tim, having only 2 slots per region in there, and the different powers of the cards, sliding those in there, and that blocker component, right? So it's card play, but it's also blocker play, and it's also adding to your
domination,
whatever it's called at the end.
Right.
Domination. There's 3 things in there with 1 card. That's a hallmark Eric Lang cleverness that's missing in Sandy Peterson versions of this game.
Yeah, I agree with what you guys said about the spaces. I learned that lesson very early on in this game because I had this big plan, and Steve threw down this card in one region that I was in, and it said each person who's got a figure in that region loses 1 power. And I needed that power. So basically it just threw off the entire rest of my... So the entire rest of this game, I ended up playing very defensively and trying to fill up those spots because otherwise I knew Steve was going to come in and do something nasty.
Yeah, and you needed to. A lot of the cards were nasty. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was like locked up in this one piece of land up in the corner where I was like, okay, I know I can take control of this. I just got to stop Chris from moving through my other region. And Steve plays a card that says send 1 character up there. He sends one of Adam's characters up to my region just to block me. And then the next turn, Adam plays a card there that lets him move characters from across the board into that region. So without those card slots covered, you just couldn't know for sure that you were going to control it or understand the board state with them. So it definitely added a lot of excitement.
Hey, let me ask you guys this. With regard to the cards, do you feel like you'd have to know the full decks of cards pretty well in order to play effectively here? Like, for example, in Blood Rage, which is another successor to this game that involves a lot of card play, you really have to know that deck, or at least you're at a huge advantage if you really know the deck. You think it was the same here?
I totally think it was the same, Chris. Once you play this game a few times through, you're going to know the cards that each faction has and how to counter those or what to look out for. At least I didn't learn it by the end of this game. Steve played that same card on me twice to take that card that was a little disappointing for me to see in an Eric Lang game that took a power from each of us and gave one back to him. Yeah, I got burned once by that earlier. At least he exposed that card earlier. Should have seen it coming, should have known about it. But, hey, those are the mistakes they're going to make along the way in a game like this. And I think that's part of the enjoyment and discovery. Then you can get the nuanced stuff later on, like we've been doing in Blood Rage. Or like the first, a couple times we played where you guys kicked my butt. And then finally I learned these cards and I could keep up with you guys a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? Like any game where you're playing it for the first time, the discovery is fun. It was fun to see, whoa, you just played that card. What did that just do? That was cool. Maybe sometimes frustrating. And that's where the challenge of not knowing the decks are. But yeah, I think if you were going to be competitive, I think it'd be hard to be competitive playing this game if 3 people knew all the cards in the deck and then the 4th person's coming in for the first time. They fully understand the rules, but if they don't know what's in those other decks and what could potentially change the board state because of those, it's going to be hard to play against. Yeah, very similar to Blood Rage.
I think the fact that we all played this was our first play for all of us was kind of a magical thing because each of us had that surprise aspect of seeing all these crazy cards come out. And I don't know that we've had a game similar to that.
That's a good point.
The other thing that I wanted to mention here was the asymmetry in this game. This was asymmetry done in a really good way. This was an area control game. Everybody has the same basic rules, very minor differences between the powers of the different types of characters you can put out or creatures. But where the asymmetry actually triggered here was in these little dials. So aside from being able to win the game by hitting 50 victory points or being the highest on the threat level when the 7 rounds were over, everyone had this little threat dial that was mounted to the board. And you all start with some small amount of threat, 1, 2, 3, or 4 points. Threat does a couple things. It dictates tiebreakers in the game. It dictates who makes decisions for certain round things. And it also means who's going to win the game in certain situations. But if you get this threat dial high enough, you actually win the game. So it's like asymmetric win conditions. And each of the characters raise their threat dial from different conditions, not drastically different. Most of it had to do with putting corruption in different regions of the board. The one character that Adam was playing, they moved their dial by attacking other characters and killing other characters. So slightly different conditions. But what was neat was that as you move this dial up, every time you move it 1 tick, you get a different benefit, a one-time benefit. And those were pretty different. Also, the number of ticks you had to do were different per faction. And there was a lot of really interesting balance decisions that we discovered through this game where it was like, hey, wait a second, Adam has to move it up like 8 ticks and Tim only has to move it up 6 ticks. But also Adam gets to go first every round and he's got higher power in his characters and he's got an easier tick condition, And so it felt like even though things were not quite the same, they felt pretty even. And every time we were like, wait, how did that decision come about? Oh, okay, it makes sense because this faction gets this other negative. The other thing that happens as you're ticking that up is there's 3 spots on each of the dials where you get to upgrade a card. And you got this little stack of 5 cards So even if you tick it up through all three of those upgrades every time, you can make different decisions, maybe based on the board state, maybe based on, how your game is playing out. Cool variability between the factions you play here.
You touched on a bunch of stuff there, Tim, and it is all fantastic. The way those wheels work as part of the asymmetry is just, it was amazing. It was another Eric Lang hallmark, I thought. You also touched on the different win conditions in this game, which I thought was really neat, almost coin-like in a way. You had one faction, well, any faction that got to 50 or more points, that ended the game. If a certain amount of provinces, five regions got ruinated, I think is the term. So a certain amount of these tokens got on the board, triggered or this landscape to get withered away, and some in-game point, end of round points would add to that 50. And what else? The game could win itself. If there's too much inactivity from us and we're not doing enough things to win the game, everybody loses. And I think there was a final win condition. Oh, if you get to the end of your wheel, that was the other win condition. Just unique win conditions in a game that, again, you don't see much of that. It's kind of atypical. It's all kind of victory points now.
Yeah, that was a really nice piece, having all these various different types of asymmetry that were all impactful, but they were all relatively understandable. One of the things I'm sure we're going to be talking about more, and you guys have already kind of mentioned, was that one sort of spiritual successor to this game was Cthulhu Wars by Sandy Peterson. And in Cthulhu Wars, it feels like I am completely hogtied unless I can fully understand everything your faction has, because the things are so extremely different that you're doing something I didn't even know you even had the capacity to do. And that's one of the weak spots of that game. That wasn't the case here. You had all these things like the win conditions, the card decks, the ways that you had to spin the dial. And one really good illustration of that was the way that Tim kind of started off this game, where he went 2 rounds in a row where he was able to tick up twice on the threat dial. And it didn't seem like that big a deal. We looked at the dials and there's a whole bunch of different spots on them, until I don't remember who it was, either Steve or Adam said, "Hey, by the way, Tim is..."
That was Steve. That was Steve.
Okay.
Of course it was Steve. Yeah, of course it was.
Tim is 2 ticks away from ending this game. And this ended up being like halfway through the game. So all of a sudden, we all learned a big lesson. We had to get back there and do something about Tim's situation, which I'm sure Tim is going to talk a little bit more about later, how that felt. But the point being that there really was a difference there. And that is an example of one of the differences where if you didn't know about it, then you could be completely snuck up on. And that's, that's not desirable.
Yeah. So the one thing about the asymmetry here that I think is a slight negative for this game, and that's just the replayability of it. I know obviously the 4 factions play different. They're going to feel different. And, you probably could have fun playing this a lot. But I think with any game where your factions are kind of driving a specific strategy and then everyone figures it out, then there's a little bit less discovery with it. And this is why even a game like Root, which is even more asymmetric, they've had to add a lot of expansions to kind of change it up to make it feel like, hey, I get to try to do different things in this game. So I think the fact that this game actually has the 4 factions, their wheels attached to the board as a physical component. Now there is some expansion to this, and I don't know if it adds another faction, but it definitely, I don't think, was expandable from an asymmetry perspective as something like Cthulhu Wars was, and that is a slight negative that the game had to offer. Now the fact that it's out of print and not being supported anymore, then it doesn't really matter. If there had been like 2 or 3 more factions in the deck that you could have swapped out and had a chance to play different factions against each other in different games, that would have added a lot to the replayability and the variability here.
Everyone says the Horned Rat expansion is the one to go after. I don't know. I've only heard the name. I don't know what it does or how it adds to the gameplay. I want to research into that now and see what exactly that does. What was the point I was going to make? Oh, Chris mentioned it. Tim was winning this game. It got pointed out. And then it turned, you could see the air just go out of the room. The mood totally shifted. It was jovial and happy. And people were joking. Tim was laughing and giggling and we were telling jokes. But then it was attack the leader time. And Tim happened to be the leader like he is in many of these games, many of these area control games. He goes out and seizes the lead. He's the first one to pick up on stuff. And then all of us are playing catch up. He could see Tim deflate over there. And I just felt, the mood shift. It was palpable.
Let me jump in here before Tim says anything. in defense of Tim's state of mind in this game, because I think he's probably going to apologize for, the way for yelling at us so much. But honestly, I completely understand. I was feeling miserable with the way we were attacking Tim and ganging up on him. It made me feel bad doing it. I think that is, boy, I think that's a weak spot of this game. And I'm not sure why exactly it was. Maybe it was because of the asymmetry, but it felt to me like there was more of an opportunity or a need for straight aggression against one player that I didn't find in Eric Lang's other games, like Rising Sun or Blood Rage or Ankh or any of those. I just didn't feel that same way. Here it really felt like you could identify the one goal that this person has and just stymie every opportunity they had for the goal. And that kind of cements my thought on it, that it really does have something to do with those asymmetric goals that you're trying to reach, because you can identify the goal and you can stop somebody from doing it. And man, I would have been super frustrated in that situation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do feel like a total a-hole for the way I acted tonight about, my response to how you guys did this. But I mean, you were playing the game, and that's what the game is. But, that's the thing, right? So we started the game out and we played a practice round. It wasn't intended to be a practice round, but we realized we got a major ruled round and we reset. But in this practice round, Steve, I don't remember what happened, but Steve played some card that completely screwed up Chris's strategy for that first round. And I was just like, ouch, I feel bad for Chris. Clearly, Chris had a plan, he had a strategy, and it just got totally ruined by this thing that he wouldn't have known to expect or was surprised by or whatever, it doesn't matter. And so I felt bad for Chris. And then halfway through the second game, well, I was the target, but I wasn't the target by one card or one action. I was the target by like everybody planning together. What can we do to stop Tim? Steve's going to send Adam over to my region and stop me. Chris is going to come in from this other side. Everyone's talking about how can we stop Tim from doing this thing? And that's just not fun for me. Like, right, I get it. That's what the game is, but it's not fun for me when the whole goal is to just stop somebody else's plans. That is rough. I don't want to see the game's fun. And this is something that even early games of Blood Rage, I had a tougher time with, right? But then you start to learn the game and you start to go into the game and say, like, I know what Blood Rage is. I'm just going to accept that I'm going to do the best I can, move around, know that I'm going to get beat up. And I think that probably another game of Chaos in the old world, I would be feeling a little bit better about it. I do think, Chris, that you're right, that it's the asymmetric win conditions. Like each player has a condition that just says you win if you get to a certain point. And there is a clear way to stop somebody from doing those things. And maybe less so on Adams. That's probably why he had to do more ticks up, because it's hard to say, like, everyone can't stop Adam from just getting into a fight. But yeah, that's probably partly why it felt a little bit more targeted. We played Circadian's Chaos Order, which is also asymmetric win conditions, but that's more of a Euro style game. Yeah, you can go in and attack. Yeah, you can do some things, but you had less ability to impact what other players are doing and really aggressively go after their strategies there. So I do think that's probably a big part of it.
Let me ask a question, and I'd like an honest answer. There was that moment of the mood shift that Adam mentioned. Did you guys have fun after that point?
I still had fun, but I definitely had less fun. And I just, I felt bad. Not only did I feel bad about, here's the deal, right? Like, it's not just about people are changing things. It's like, I honestly felt like Adam's entire goal the rest of the game was not to win the game. It wasn't to win at all. He had no interest in winning. He only cared about stopping me from winning. That's how the game felt to me. And that's not fun to me, right? That makes me feel bad. Now, that's probably not the case. And it doesn't help that as he's doing that, then Steve's like, oh yeah, Adam, I'll help you out. I'll go do this here. And so it just like, it was just piled on top. And every time I was just like, okay, Tim, you got to just chill out. It's just a game, have fun. You're ruining the mood for everybody else. Then it would keep happening. Then a bad dice roll would happen, whatever. I don't know. So the game went down there, but it's not the first game that's done this. This happened to me in a game of Eclipse before, which is a game that I find fun. It's happened to me in a game of Blood Rage before. Like, I just don't do well with being piled on. It always ruins the fun a little bit for me when I'm not ready for that experience, I think.
I could see when you're not ready for that experience, that'd be rough. To answer Chris' original question, I still had fun. It was hampered a little bit by seeing that mood shift in Tim. I think this kind of game, if you're ready for it, like you said, Tim, I think that's the important part. If you're ready for it and you know that this can happen, you happen to be in the lead this time, we went after you. If Chris was in the lead, same thing, we would have gone after him. I think that's exhilarating to be in a position where you can win the game. Can you hold on to it? You know these people are going to come at you. Do you have the cards? Do you have the wit to hold on to that lead and take it, even while everybody's gunning for you? I think that's absolutely fantastic. I think this game has the potential to do that. PAX Premier Second Edition. That's why I love that game so much. I've had games of that where this guy's in the lead. Okay, it's my turn. I have to stop him before that domination card comes up. And then he does do it. And now the next guy, and while doing so, puts himself in a position to lead. Now the next guy has to take that guy down. This game does it a little bit differently. It gives you that round structure to try to target the leader and make your play at making sure he doesn't win and put yourself in a position to win. And that's what I was trying to do. And, Chris was trying to do the same thing. Stopped him, put himself in a position to win. And Steve, I think, was trying to do the same thing too. You got to stop the guy in the lead, put yourself in a position to win. And that, to me, that's just exhilarating.
Yeah, I will admit the fun factor dropped significantly when that started happening for me. And not because Tim was, saying this or that or the other thing. I mean, we're all used to Tim complaining that everybody's ganging up on him. That's nothing new. But it really did feel like it shifted. I have no problem with aggression in a game. I love aggression in a game, but I don't like the ganging up. I think that's one of the things that we've talked about before, the whole, king of the hill kind of knock the leader down. I don't love that. And I think, like we were saying before, this game really lends itself to that. And that definitely gives me kind of second thoughts about my feelings on this game.
Yeah, there's an opportunity to pile on here. And I think in a way, again, if we're going to compare it to Eric Lang's follow-on to this, which would have been Blood Rage, you don't gang on as much. You can, right? You can say, hey, don't let him get away with that. Go into that region. But it's a little bit, it feels a little bit less straightforward aggression and more just like, hey, I'm going to go in and, do this thing that's going to help me. I'm going to compete for it. I've got this card I can throw. Now, the other thing that I think hampered my fun personally, and that is the combat in this game. This is, again, very much like Cthulhu Wars. You're throwing a handful of dice based on the number of the amount of power that you've got in the region based on the characters there. And if you compare this to Eric Lang's other trilogy games, some of the fun parts about those games are the combat. The combat mechanisms are interesting. They're unique. They're, you're playing a mind trick with this is just rolling dice. And I got burned so bad by the dice tonight in this. Now, I did find it more fun than Cthulhu Wars, because Cthulhu Wars, when you roll this big handful of dice, 4s and 5s are what they call pains. You push characters out of the region. A 6 is a kill. It always feels like you can never really do anything in a combat, and that's not fun either. But this one, holy cow! I mean, so many times I got into fights with Adam with like equal power, or maybe even sometimes more. And Adam's hitting the 6s, which then has the exploding dice. That's fun. You hit a 6, you get to re-roll again. So it gave some exciting chances, and they triggered here. But when all I did was rolled 1s and 2s, through almost every combat tonight, that was really, it was so annoying, so frustrating. So, that's going to come with when the game is, and the game was decided by dice roll tonight in the final round. I would have won the game if Adam didn't happen to roll a 6. He had to roll a 6 in the final round so that he could get a second hit out of it. He got it and got another hit, and he won the game because of it. So,
I didn't even come close to winning the game.
No, you didn't. You cost me from winning the game.
Oh yeah, okay.
You didn't win the game. You stopped me from winning the game because of that dice roll. So that's so dice roll is a combat mechanism. We've talked about it before. Is almost never fun. Here, there's exciting moments sometimes. They can be okay, but when they're just completely dictated by fate and almost nothing else, that's
I'm usually not a fan of the dice here. I thought it was epic here. Again,
I bet you did, because you got so many freaking 6s in this game.
I told you ahead of time I had practiced my dice rolls, and it showed. You just got to go. You just got to put the hours in, Tim. But no, any clips, can get a little long. Here, it's quicker. That exploding dice, if you get a 6, you get to re-roll. That gives you just the tiniest shred of hope that one of your little characters can go in there against the odds and beat the big guy. And if they're as well practiced as I am at rolling the dice, you will get to see it in action like we did tonight.
Hey, let me shift gears here a little bit and talk about something we haven't really gotten into, and that is the straight area control aspect of this game. And here's something fascinating. There are 3 different types of area control, so to speak, in this game. One is the cards. We talked about that. There are 2 spots. It's not exactly area control, but you can control the ability of other people to affect things in that zone by the placement of your cards. And that was kind of cool. There's also area control in the domination sense, where you're counting up the number of figures you have in a spot and the cost of any cards that you've played there. And that creates opportunity for scoring with the domination. And then you've got area control with the corruption. That area control, you're building up those corruption tokens over time. And you get to a point once ruination's happened that you're then collecting up these really big points based on how much corruption you have in that particular zone. And so, man, it was like my head was spinning with all the different ways that you had to exercise area control in this game.
What was really interesting is this another game where the first time you play, you're like, of course I want to hold this region for the first couple of rounds because I'm going to get a point or 2 points out of it. And then we realized by the end of the game, I think like 3 of us were at 8 to 10 points. And Chris got like 25 to 30 points because he had majority corruption when that region got corrupted. So it's kind of like, yeah, holding these regions are not that impactful. Get in there, like hit your goals that you need to hit and focus on getting corruption into the regions because that's where the real points are at if the game goes that long. So definitely an interesting learning experience there, but cool stuff going on.
And this is going into theme a little bit. That was highly thematic too. Chris's faction was this virus that had spread and reached that critical point right in the nick of time. And he just exploded out, spread all over the world, and got the points for it. The thematics here, I thought, matched up fantastic with the factions.
I was like a pandemic.
All right, well, let's talk about the theme and production of Chaos in the Old World.
Right, so I just mentioned it. I thought the thematics were pretty great. Each faction seemed to lend itself toward its namesake or whatever. You had Steve's guys, we joked, were like the accountants and taxing everybody for doing this and taking away their money and making them spend extra to move into a zone. So very manipulative, controlling the kind of currency of things. Chris's faction was spreading. He had so many guys all over the board. And as soon as that critical point hit, those cards flipped. He just swooped in with all these points. And my guys were just supposed to go and kill people. And that's what I did. That's how I got my ticks on my wheel. So it was neat. It was implemented well. I really enjoyed the theme here in Chaos in the Old World.
Yeah, I found it really interesting. And I've got a lot to say about the production in this game, both good and bad. First of all, this game is dark. I mean, it's pretty rare that I come across a game that's a little dark for my taste. I mean, I like dark. I like kind of grotesque. Man, this one is really something else. The game board is basically a map on a stretched out piece of human skin with hooks through it. So if anybody's seen the movie Hellraiser before, that'll give you some idea of, what it is I'm talking about there. Pretty horrifying. My guy was this big, fat, grody monster that had a big slice across his belly and his guts hanging out. That's pretty gnarly. Tim's character, I don't even go into that. There was some weird anatomically correct stuff happening there that just didn't seem appropriate. But I mean, it made me feel like, man, this is a little bit darker of a world than I really want to be hanging out in. And I like games like Nemesis. So that says something. In terms of the board itself, beyond just the art style, it was a little bit difficult to maneuver around this board. There was not a lot of space. You had a lot of things you had to put on the board. There wasn't a lot of space to do it. And the graphics, like this kind of carved up, stitched together piece of human skin, looked really cool, but it really made it difficult to understand where the boundaries were between the various places you were moving. There were a couple times when I put a character, a figure, or a token or something in one spot, and then I forgot where it was supposed to be. Was it in this zone or was it in that zone? Because you had to kind of set it off to the side because there wasn't enough space in there in the first place, and the boundaries were a little bit difficult to distinguish. So I found that a little bit challenging, even if it did look really interesting and the art was cool.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think this is a great comparison from a board layout perspective than something like Cthulhu Wars, which actually did it a little bit better and smoother, or even Blood Rage. They had this big board and only about 2/3 or maybe a little bit less actually had the map on it, which is this where you're really piling all these figures and these components and these tokens. And you need to see the space on it. And then half the board was just spaces to put your card piles as well as where those dials were. And those really should have been just, kind of off the main board, maybe on a sideboard or something like that. And you could have opened this up and left a lot more space on there. But it was challenging to fit everything where you needed to and see where the borders were. Yeah, definitely a little tricky. Chris mentioned the darkness of the theme here, and there's something about it. Like I don't think this game would be made with this theme as a kind of at least a retail game. I mean, obviously there's still Kickstarters that are coming out that are dark, that have sexualized figures and that have disgusting stuff going on. But this does not seem like a mainstream type of production these days. I agree. It's a little dark. There's something about it, right? Like when I was 13, these things would have all been fascinating to me, and not just the naked women in it or the whatever, but it's also just like there's an element of like grossness and the death and stuff like that that's fascinating. When I was a younger kid, I was like into that. Now it's not a place I want to spend time with, like Chris said. The last thing I want to mention about the production here, though, is that, this game's out of print. It's not being made anymore, but it does feel dated to me. And it reminds me of like looking back at comic books in the late 70s and early 80s. You open up a comic, go into a store right now, go find some back copy of a comic from early 1982 and open it up, and the art's a little bit washed out. It's perfectly fine art, but it's not well colored. It's not particularly remarkable. It just feels like somebody going through the work of drawing human beings. And then you get into the 90s when you get like comic book artists like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee doing artwork that is just remarkable. It's got unique styles to it. It's more brightly colored. It's got more of a flair, and that's how game production is. And in some ways, it's great. It's great that today, if you buy a game, the artwork is not going to be as washed out. It's not going to be as just like plain. It's going to have a style to it. But in some cases too, it's probably overblown, and there's too many pockets on your characters, and there's too many muscles to be realistic. So sometimes productions go in the opposite direction. So it's not terrible, but it does feel a bit dated. I don't know. I went on a long tangent there, but that's what it reminded me of. It reminded me of opening up an old 1982 comic book when I was 1996, and just the difference. You could feel the difference between this game versus something you would take off the shelf today.
I agree with you, Tim. It's interesting. It's relatively beigey, like you said, or sepia for those terms we usually use to describe a Euro. It is kind of washed out. The board does have that monochromatic feel to it. And yeah, Chris, you mentioned it too. Just it's difficult to distinguish the borders, and I couldn't really tell where all this stuff was. I asked a few times, and that one section in the corner just gets a little tight. So small annoyances and peculiarities and interesting observations you guys had with the production.
All right, well, let's jump into our final question, and that is, would you request to play this? And I think we have to make some comparisons here, both between Cthulhu Wars, which is a game we've talked about a decent amount, but maybe some of Eric Lang's more recent Troops on a Map types of games, because there are some similarities here too. So feel free to use those in your final thoughts here.
This is an interesting one for me. I think I would request to play this in the right circumstance. If I could take a time machine back to 90, in my teenage years when maybe a game like this was where it was at. But, I don't know. If this game was all set up and somebody had it ready to go, I would happily engage in playing this game. I thought it had some very interesting things going on. I had tons of fun playing this game, and I think it'd be fun to try those other factions. Putting the production aside, I still think it'd be super fun to get into all these, see how they work. The longevity of it. You made some good points on that, Tim. But for now, yeah, I think I would. A soft yes, I would request to play this one again. Not my most super convincing, but I got to give it another try or two for sure.
Adam is my spirit animal. He said it. I would play this one again, and I think I would even ask to play it again. But I also don't think that this is one that would have a lot of longevity for me. A couple more games may be enough. The sophistication of Eric Lang's later games, some of that's missing here. This one also felt, I thought, clunkier because like there was some good parts about that triple area control aspect of it, but that also created a lot of rules and a lot of things you had to keep track of. And oh my goodness, I had a 2-page long player aid to use to keep track of all the phases of this game. Because you had like 5 phases, and each of the 5 phases was broken down into like 7 sub-phases. So there was a lot of things happening in there that just made it, you were constantly being taken out of the game and the mood by tracking the next thing that had to be done in the sequence of getting through your round. It was still fun, and I really enjoyed it, but I sat there the whole time thinking, man, I'd rather be playing Blood Rage, or I'd rather be playing Ankh, or I'd rather be playing Rising Sun. I don't know. But there's definitely a lot of improvement that happened in Eric Lang's game development over time. I also feel like I have to compare this one to Cthulhu Wars, and I actually felt like playing those two games, I'm pretty even on them. There's good points and bad points of both of them. I think I'd rather play most of Eric Lang's new games a lot more than I'd rather play Cthulhu Wars. But this one, I thought that there was definitely, there was a lot of similarities, of course, but I think I probably enjoy this one and Cthulhu Wars about the same.
Well, I really liked Chaos in the Old World, believe it or not, as much as I made everyone else's night miserable by my complaining. I think this game mechanically is really good. One thing we forgot to mention mechanically, and that is there's basically events that happen at the beginning of every round. So there's this randomized events. That's fun to me. I wish that was in more games. Like the fact that the game state is going to change, and the person who's in the back, who's doing the worst in the game, gets to make some critical decisions about that. So it gives them a little bit of a tool to kind of catch up or get in the way of the leader that isn't direct attacking necessarily.
The least threat, which worked to Chris's advantage a lot of the time, which
Yeah.
he had the most points, but the least threat. So that was kind of interesting to see that dynamic.
Yeah, it was very interesting. And so I like that. And I liked the card play. I think that's one of the things that I really liked about this game. Every time I started my turn, I had a few new cards, new decisions to make. It wasn't just the cards I drafted in the previous rounds. It wasn't just the characters that were on the board for my faction. I got to play with some different abilities, and I like the variability in games like that. So I think, that they were all fun decisions. They were fun turns. And it was very fun for me to play. So yeah, there's some things that are a little clunky. I can see what Chris is saying there, but I didn't really, they didn't bother me. The only thing I would complain about here that probably would turn me off from going back to this game more is the dice. If the combat mechanism was a little bit more interesting, then it would have been definitely a lot bigger draw for me. It's a clear winner over Cthulhu Wars for me. To me, it's a straight upgrade almost every way. Even the dice use and the attacking is more fun and interesting. The card play is more interesting. The lack of having to track 6 unique variable powers on every player board was easier. It was much easier to get in and play this. I read the rule book to learn this. I didn't watch any videos or anything, and it was an easy learn. Like, I just got through the rule book, and I had to go back and reference it a couple times after I read it 2 days ago. But I really like this game, and I think it would rank for me with some of my top Eric Lang games after a first play. Like this, Blood Rage, Rising Sun, any one of those 3 could be, depending on how I'm feeling that day, my choice if I was going to pull out a game. So I could definitely see this being on someone's shelf and we're picking a game and I'm like, yeah, let's get Chaos in the Old World out. And I think I would have more fun with it on a second play once I kind of, realize the dynamic. Maybe I would, I don't know. Something goes good days and bad days for me with this type of game, but I had a lot of fun with it. I think it's a strong game still. Would love to see an updated version with a different theme, like get it out of the Warhammer world or leave it there, but just freshen it up and, modernize it a little bit. And then I'd much rather play it, I think, but maybe a second edition, new artwork, new production, and a few refined rules. That could be a really cool game.
Just to touch on the Cthulhu Wars comparison, I agree with you, Tim. I would take Chaos in the Old World any day over Cthulhu Wars, the dice combat more. And almost everything you said verbatim, Tim. I will easily take Chaos over Cthulhu.
All right, cool. Well, that will wrap up our conversation on Chaos in the Old World, as it's a game that's out of print and none of us own it. It's likely to be the last time we ever talk about it, but it was fun to experience it anyway. Let's jump into some games that have been on our table right after this. All right, welcome back. What have you guys had on your table this week?
So we have been playing My City by Rainier Knizia over on Board Game Arena, running through, is it the whole campaign? Did we finish the whole campaign today?
No, we didn't. For some reason it ended, but we got through game 15 or something like that out of the 24 games I think you can play.
And I don't know, I thought it was okay. So it's a campaign game. Each game you're filling in this city with little tetrominoes, different colors. I think there's 3 different colors. A 4th color gets added in later on, and then maybe more after that. I don't know. But there's these rules, right? First, spoilers coming up, everybody. If you don't want to know spoilers, I'll give you a rule for the first game of the first round. You have to start your city by a river. So you place one of the colors there, it goes by the river, and then every subsequent piece has to be adjacent to another piece. You can't cross the river. There's different placement restrictions. So there you go. You're on your way, building your city with these Tetris-shaped pieces. And then the scoring criteria changes over the course of the game. First game, for instance, is cover up the most spaces, leave the most trees open. And I don't know if there's some other aspects. Rocks might be involved somehow or another. So I'm spoiling everything if you guys haven't played it. Not really. I'm trying to be vague about it. But the rules evolve. The scoring changes at the end of each scenario that you play, and you're marching on through these different scenarios where it can get more complex. It's just different rule changes happen. If you finish worse off in the scenario, that specific scenario, maybe you get some stickers to help you out that theoretically give you an advantage in the next scenario that you go on to. So it's okay. It's an interesting puzzle, I thought, for the first 3 or 4 scenarios. And then it got a little samey for me. Place your guys here, try to calculate out how you're going to spin this guy to put him in the right place to meet the scoring criteria for this particular round. I started to get it felt a little tedious for me after a game, I don't know, 7 or 8. But it wasn't horribly tedious. I still enjoy the activity of, all right, how's this? I still enjoy the puzzle, but it wasn't like super exciting. I wasn't looking forward to, what's gonna happen this time? What's this scenario gonna be about? How am I gonna place this piece in exactly the right way? And so that was kind of my impressions on my city.
Yeah, there's some games that you see pop up, it's your turn, and you get excited about it. This is the one where my turn popped up, and I'm like, okay, well, I got to get through this. It's fine. It's okay. I find it about as engaging as a game of Jenga. It's really simple, not something I want to do over and over and over again, but, for a few minutes a day, maybe fun.
My city is engaging as a game of Jenga. You got the tagline right there. I disagree with you guys on this one for sure. I mean, for a light game, what I really expected to happen with this was that I expected it to be one of these games where it's like a 10-minute activity and it doesn't fulfill me in any significant way. But I think for some reason, maybe it's the legacy components of it. This game gets me excited every time I play it. Now, I happen to be at about the same place in 3 campaigns simultaneously, 2 on Board Game Arena, one of them, which was with you guys that you just talked about, but one of them in person as well. My neighbor had a copy, played through the legacy with his wife. And since it's a 4-player game, you can actually reset and just play through the whole legacy game again with 2 other players. So he handed his copy to me, and I've been playing with Danielle. And I love this game, but you got to take it in small doses. The great thing about it is that the doses are very small. When we want to sit down and play a game, we'll play, and it takes about 10 minutes or less to play through a game of this. So we'll get through a whole they kind of have the game separated into like stories or chapters. And so each chapter is 3 games. And in that chapter, there's usually some overriding significant rules change and then just slight differences between each of the games. So when we sit down, we'll play through a chapter in about 25 to 30 minutes, all 3 games. And that's usually exactly the right amount. It's like, this is a game that we're like, hey, we got 15 minutes before we're going to go to the movie. Okay, bust out My City. It takes 30 seconds to set up. We play through a game, and then we're excited when we get back from the movie to finish those last 2 games. But then by the 3rd game, we're like, okay, let's put that away, and then we'll come back to it in a few days or whatever. So the way we've been playing it on Board Game Arena, where it's just like this constantly cycling thing that's happening every time you get on Board Game Arena, it's your turn again. I don't think that's the optimal way to play it. And I also don't think you get the fun of experiencing the legacy components on Board Game Arena. Even though you do some of those activities, it is fun to finish a game. Oh, great, I got first place. I get to mark a little, like actually write on my board to show my whole campaign points. But also, I get to take the sticker off the sheet and decide where to place it on my map. Maybe with not really a good idea of what it means for the future, but it's exciting nevertheless. And I've had a lot of fun with this. Enough fun that I would absolutely go back and actually start the campaign over again. Again, in person has been more fun for me, but Danielle and I played a 2-player. And I think the one negative with me for a 2-player game is that the legacy components are most impactful when you have the 3rd or 4th player, because usually it's going to change a lot what you get to do based on where you place in that campaign. In a 2-player game, there's almost no difference. First place gets 2 campaign points, second place gets 1 campaign point throughout the whole campaign. And then usually very minor differences. One person places a sticker at the end of the game or whatever. But the game does get fascinating. We didn't want to spoil the really the mechanisms that get revealed here. But I found that the changes to what you're trying to do every game and every chapter is very interesting. And the last chapter we played online with our campaign, I really liked how it kind of gave you an in-game goal that you're trying to do aside from working around the whole end game point scoring goals. Found it fun. So haven't played through the whole campaign yet, but so far I've been having a lot of fun with it. So yeah, for me, it hit a little bit more, I think, than it did for you guys, and I'd be happy to go back to it, and I probably will.
So my table this week has been graced by the beautiful Tapestry Playmat that I recently got from Stonemaier Games. I've talked about this game a ton, so I won't get into the details of the game. It's one of my top 2, 3 of all time. And so any opportunity I get to improve the play of this game is a great opportunity. And this playmat is absolutely awesome. One of the things that I find a little bit frustrating about Tapestry is that there are so many different pieces you have to lay out. There's buildings and there's this and there's that. And they all have, they're sitting all over the place. There's piles of space tiles. There's bags of terrain tiles. This has a space for everything. It's an absolute delight to play on. It's big enough that it could actually be a little intimidating. If you have a smaller table, it might not be an ideal thing for that. But if you have a big enough table, what a great addition this is to someone who likes to play the game. It also includes both the standard base game, and it also has an area for the arts and architecture track, which is another thing that you have to keep separate and add in as another sideboard if you're playing with that expansion, which we've played before and actually really enjoyed. And so my wife and I got this one out, and we're kind of trying all the different variations, the different expansions and stuff. And this is a game that she likes as well. So it's one of the ones that I can occasionally get to the table, and had a super fun time with it. She trounced me, stomped me embarrassingly. I think I had something like 120 points and she had like 300 points. So I'm not sure how that happens. I think it's kind of like, when I play Tapestry, I always feel like I don't actually play with a strategy. I'm kind of like, Pinball Wizard from that old, Who song. Like I play by sense of smell. And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. But regardless, this is a great opportunity to get an added component for the game that I really do think makes the play experience more pleasant. And I think that's always a nice thing to say about an upgraded.
Cool, Chris. I'm glad you liked it. I got to pick this up. One of my favorite games as well. Big neoprene mat's great. I like you said, that there's not stuff all over the place. The one thing I didn't really like when I looked at it is that there's a decent amount of blank space on the board and it's just blue. And it feels a little plain to me. The blank space that's kind of around the boards and stuff like that. So, I don't know. For looking at it, just pictures online, it felt a little bit like, not too exciting to look at. But I'm sure it still makes the whole experience a little bit more fun.
How big is the mat compared to like the regular game board itself? And then how is the resolution? I've heard with some of these mats, the resolution kind of disappears a little bit. You can't see the little details, the fun details on the landscape and terrain. How does that compare?
I think that's a fair criticism but I think that's also kind of true of any neoprene mat. I'd never seen one that really kind of keeps the full, like printed on a piece of cardboard type of resolution.
Right.
It's not bad enough that it bothers me. I'm okay with it. But I do think, if you're one of those people who likes to look at all the little Easter egg, little pictures on the terrain, that might be a little bit of a bummer. In terms of the size, I couldn't tell you in terms of like feet or inches or anything, but you basically have your base game board. And then on the side, you have a strip where you have a place for all of the different buildings, the, what do they call the landmark buildings? There's a space for all of those. There's a space added on the other end for the arts and architecture track. So that adds that much additional space. On another side, you have a space for all of your different card decks, which is also nice because in the game, in the base game, you're just stacking these stacks of cards next to the board. And that's a little bit, I don't think ideal. So it adds all of this stuff is spread around. So it doesn't make it huge, but it definitely does increase the size of it.
How big are the hexagons on the base game compared to the size of hexagons on the mat?
I think they're about the same.
And I'll mention really quick, after Chris posted about this on Twitter, one of our listeners commented and mentioned that there's a couple minor misprints on the map. Chris, did you notice that? Did it impact your gameplay at all?
I didn't. And actually, I remember thinking about that when I was playing because I had read that comment as well. And I couldn't remember what it was. So I was trying to look at the board and see if I could figure it out. And I couldn't do it. So maybe I just didn't look at the right place. But I want to go back and look at it.
Yeah, I think he said it on the 2 to 3 player side. One of the bonuses on the game, on the side where you have to give up 3 technology cards to get 10 points, I think it's printed as 2 technology cards to get 10 points, which honestly I think is an improvement. That's a change that Jamie Stegmeyer had said he might make on the map, and I wonder if they tested it on one side and then didn't finalize it on both sides or something. The other was that I think that they had extra bonus spaces on the 2 to 3 player side of the map, which it might have been intentional. I don't know, but it sounds like it slightly changes it from the base 2 to 3 player game.
Yeah, that first thing you mentioned there about the technology cards, I do remember that now. Not because I was thinking about the particular comment from our listener, but because when my wife and I were playing this, she was heavily focused on those technology cards and got to that point and had to turn in the cards or had the option to turn in the cards and just did the math in her head. And it's like, but I get more points from having these cards just sitting in my hand in end of round scoring. Why would I ever turn those in for the 10 points? So, maybe the two cards probably did make, I think, a little bit more sense than the 3 cards would.
All right, cool. Let me just jump into one final game I played. I got a chance to play a game in person with a few people this week, and that is A War of Whispers. War of Whispers is published by Starling Games, and it's kind of interesting. Guys, remember when we reviewed Robotech Reconstruction, which was almost 2 years ago now, and that game was not published at the time we played it on Tabletop Simulator. Well, apparently it is available to purchase now. You can order it directly from the publisher's website. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because the editor on that game reached out to me shortly after we did that review and mentioned, hey, I also live in Arizona if you ever want to get together and play games sometime. Well, he reached out to me right after Christmas again and said, hey, I just got this game, A War of Whispers, for Christmas. You want to get to play? So I played with the editor of Robotech Reconstruction. His name's Alex. And he brought over a copy of A War of Whispers, and I invited a couple other friends over. And War of Whispers is a pretty interesting game. I think you guys might really dig this one. This is a kind of an area control game, but basically there is 5 factions represented on the board, and you don't control a faction. What you're doing is trying to use different actions to move any of the factions around. Everybody controls all the factions, basically. But at the start of the game, each of those 5 factions are going to be worth different points for you at the end of the game. So nobody knows what they are except for you. You have these face down tokens. And so you know which faction you want to have the most cities controlled at the end of the game. And also, as it goes down the track, one of the factions is going to get you 0 points. You don't care about that one at all, but then one of them is going to be negative points. So you're trying to take movements without really maybe letting other people know what you're trying to do, and basically make this situation worse for a couple of factions out on the map and then make it better for some of the other factions. The way that's presented is a pretty cool action selection mechanism. It's printed. It's a big round board, and printed around the outside of this board are the 5 different factions, and each of them has 4 different spots. I think they're called council seats, but basically each player is going to be sending in the first round 2 randomly, in turn order. You're going to place 2, spies or whatever out to these council seats. And so you'll take turn order, you'll place them out there. And then after everyone's placed, you'll trigger them from left on this circle all the way around the map. And so let's say that there's one person in the far right council seat in the first region. They actually get to activate all council seats that are in their space, but every council seat to the left of it as well. So there's 4 different actions that can be activated. And if you're the only one in that region, you can activate all 4 of them. But if 2 people are there, you always activate all of them that are to the left of your character in that space. So you might get anywhere from 1 to 4 actions with each of these spies that you put out in these locations. And the actions do things like move in, banners around the board, which are the kind of the troops, or adding new troops to the board, or drawing faction related cards, which give you some special benefits you can play when you're activating that faction. So does some pretty typical area control types of activities, except that you're not controlling your own faction. You're controlling all these factions and trying to move things around the board. This was a really interesting game. I liked the action selection. It was kind of tense. After the first round, everyone's placed 2 factions, two spies out on these action components. Then the next round, everyone removes one and places two more. So you escalate. You basically are adding more of these spies out to these regions until they're almost pretty full at the end. And it gets really interesting, tense. You start to realize what's happening. And at some point during the game, at the end of each round, you have the choice of revealing two of the tokens that you have on your board that shows what their value are and swapping them. So if you realize, hey, things are definitely not going to go well for the yellow faction, and I want to put that in my, in my like negative point space, or I want to put it at a lower point score because I know I'm not going to get a lot of points for it, and swap it with the one that's going to do better. But then other people know at that point what you're going for. And so they might start to try to shift things away from you. Make some pretty cool decisions without feeling too mean or aggressive, because most of the game, you really don't know who you're hurting or who you're helping. You're just really trying to help yourself without giving too much away. It was a cool game. I don't, it wasn't something that I would be super excited to go back to a lot, but I think you guys would probably have fun with it, and I'd be happy to go back to it. Really cool production, beautiful artwork. I don't remember the artist's name, and I don't have it pulled up, but it was, I think, a Polish designer a Polish artist who remind me a lot of Jakub Brzezalski's work on Scythe. Similar type of kind of photorealistic pastoral art with ninjas in there and troops and things like that. This was a pretty neat game, very, very unique from my perspective.
This is one I've heard about, Tim, and I've always been intrigued by it. I feel like I'll hear something good about it and something that sounds amazing, and then every once in a while I'll hear something kind of negative about it, and maybe I don't know. So having never played this one, I've been intrigued by it. I would love to try this one, and it's something that's been, I don't know, off and on my radar over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm looking at it on BGG right now, and I won't lie, I didn't really follow entirely everything you're saying about how the game works, but it sounds like it would be interesting. It looks beautiful. The production looks amazing, and that, just the theming and the production look like they'd be enough to draw me in for a first game. And it sounds like there's some fun to be had there.
Yeah, and I didn't mention the designer's name is Jeremy Stolzius, and the artist's name is Tomasz Zedrusik. And the other artist credited is Dan May. Now, Dan May is the art designer for Everdell, so not the artist, but the kind of the art director for it. And I think Dan did the board artwork here, would be my guess, because it's kind of a fairly simple style. Well, the card artwork, I think, was done by this Tomas here. But yeah, really neat production. Again, interesting game. Something I would be happy to go back to. But I would say something about it didn't make me excited to go back and play it again, but I'd be happy to. There was no flaws with it. It was interesting decisions, a unique type of interaction. It's hard to get excited about your actions when you're not doing something for yourself. You're just pushing things around and hoping that they fall where it makes sense for you.
And I think that's the complaint that I've heard about it, is that how much impact are you having? Are you, I don't know if it's a lack of agency or a seeming lack of agency might have been the chief complaint I've heard about.
Yeah. I suspect, Adam, and I don't know how that game you talked about a couple of weeks ago, Imperial 2030 or whatever that is.
Oh yeah.
Playing this is kind of how I pictured that game to go, where you're kind of moving stuff around and like everyone's got control of the map, but I don't know if it's similar.
And I think I've heard them mentioned in similar comparisons.
Okay. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, I think that will wrap up this episode of Board Game Hot Takes. If you enjoy the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Until next week, take care, everybody.
Good night, all.
Bye-bye.